Welcome back to our series on climate change and its impact on Eastern North Carolina. I'm your host, Natalia Sanchez Loayza. In each episode, we've learned a bit more about how extreme weather is affecting the people and industries that shape this region. We've heard from workers and experts in various fields, and today, in our final episode, we move to a different arena, one that's familiar to so many in North Carolina. An activity that makes fall Friday nights so special: high school football. And to tell us more about what happens behind the scenes of each practice and how the health and safety of every player is maintained, I sat down with another expert.
My name is Jana Fonseca, and I am the Director of Health, Safety, and Wellness for the North Carolina High School Athletic Association. I've been in this position for just about 2 years, and I am a licensed athletic trainer here in the state of North Carolina.
Fonseca's career began on the field, though not on the athlete's side.
It's actually kind of a funny story. I was in high school. I was in the marching band. And in the marching band, you would do the pregame and the halftime show, but then during the rest of the football game, you would sit in the stands.
Fonseca played the saxophone, and her friend played the flute. They sat together because the woodwinds were always grouped together. And from there,
we saw these kids, like our peers, on the sidelines of the football game, not the athletes, but other people helping, carrying water bottles, things like that, putting Band-Aids on, helping, with blood. And they had these really great jackets. Like, this was the late 90s, and it was all about, what swag your club had, right? And like who had the coolest gear.
So Fonseca and her friend needed to find out what club that was, because they wanted to get those cool jackets too. They wanted to wear that gear.
And it was actually athletic training students.
A group that Fonseca had never heard of. She immediately signed up. Then she had to take a first aid class and started shadowing the school's certified athletic trainer. She was responsible for the basics, like learning basic taping techniques.
But we got good kind of exposure to athletics and all the different varieties of sports. I went to a large high school in Nebraska, and so we had, football and volleyball and basketball and all the things. So I got exposed to athletic training because I wanted a cool jacket. And so that's kind of how it all started. And I absolutely just fell in love with it from the beginning. I enjoyed, learning about anatomy and physiology, but then I also really enjoyed being on the sidelines and being around athletics.
So she dedicated herself to studying this field. She met her husband in the same line of work, and they moved to North Carolina in 2005. In addition to still working in athletics, her whole family is also very interested in this subject.
We have, a house full of athletes.
She has a 16-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. Her son is a sophomore in high school. He plays baseball, basketball, and also goes fishing. Her daughter, an 8th grader, plays soccer, basketball, and volleyball.
And I call ourselves athletic supporters too, right? Because it's always it's always sports that's on TV in our house. We're always watching, games. We love watching the Little League World Series that just finished up. So that's just, our household revolves very much around sports, but it's fun.
When we sat down to talk in August of this year, Fonseca told me that last year was a special moment for her because her son started high school just as she had been in her role as Director of Health, Safety, and Wellness for the North Carolina High School Athletic Association for less than a year.
It really hit home for me last year. I mean, it's always been important. Health and safety as an athletic trainer, you're always looking at things that you can do to prevent injury from even happening, right? To prevent illness, to prevent the spread of illness, to, make sure athletes' bodies are ready. Then you also focus on what you can do immediately after, right? In terms of treatment and intervention. And my work felt really more impactful the year that my son started high school.
Her son was also an athlete in middle school, but in high school, everything became more serious.
When he started ninth grade and it was that official, like, okay, here's all the forms he needs to fill out, and here's, the formal policies and procedures, things that I was intimate with from a work standpoint, now I know directly affect him, right? And his participation and his teammates' participation. So that was a really big turning point, I think, for me professionally as well as personally, because I felt like what I was doing carried a bit more weight because I knew that my own child was impacted. And so kind of being able to serve, not just him, but his peers, but, the hundreds of thousands of kids across the state who are active and who are participating in our programs.
Any public or non-boarding parochial high school in North Carolina can join the North Carolina High School Athletic Association if it is accredited by the State Department of Public Instruction and upholds a required code to ensure fair competition. The association is a voluntary nonprofit corporation that administers its interscholastic athletic program.
So our mission is to provide governance and leadership for interscholastic athletic programs that support and enrich students' educational experiences. So we really focus very strongly on education-based athletics. And I think it's important to emphasize that word education comes before athletics, right? And that the term student comes before student athlete because they are first and foremost students. So it's our job here in the office to basically ensure that all of our member schools are compliant with all of our policies and procedures. We serve our member schools. They're the reason why we come to work every day. So those of us here in the office really just do on the daily level, just work to ensure that our member schools understand our policies and procedures.
Because sometimes there is room for interpretation when it comes to some of those policies and procedures. And that's where Jana Fonseca and her office come in. The association has 7 sports in the fall that culminate in championships: cheerleading, cross-country, football, men's soccer, volleyball, women's golf, and women's tennis. In the winter, there are basketball, indoor track and field, swimming and diving, and wrestling. And in the spring, baseball, lacrosse, men's golf, men's tennis, softball, track and field, and women's soccer, with soccer being the most popular sport in the state.
And so all of our policies broadly apply to all of those sports, right? Football by nature is the most visible, right? It's Friday night lights. It's the sporting event that brings everybody, it brings communities together. That's been going on for a long time. And that goes on, everywhere in the country. That is not unique to North Carolina. But I think it is important to note that that's just, one of the sports, even though it sometimes is the most visible.
Fonseca's work as a director of health, safety, and wellness focuses on finding an important balance for any student athlete participating in any of those sports.
We know that physical activity is so beneficial, right? For physical development, for emotional development, for mental health. But we know we have to balance that with policies and procedures to make sure that it's done in the safest way possible.
And to do this, Fonseca has a unique approach.
I like to think of kind of 4 H's when it comes to health and safety. Health being kind of one, because you want to understand athletes' pre-existing conditions, if they have anything. You want to understand their health history. You want to know if they're diabetic or if they're asthmatic or if they are tested positive for sickle cell trait, because all of those things can be affected by physical activities.
Understanding their health means understanding their background before any game.
And having policies around heat, which we're talking about today, heart, so preventing sudden cardiac arrest and having plans in place to address sudden cardiac arrest, and then head for concussion injuries, right?
So health, heat, heart, and head.
And so kind of understanding policies in those four big areas, I think, is a really important starting point foundationally to preventing sudden death in sport. Because at the end of the day, that's really what we're trying to do.
Prevent any injuries and any losses. And as Fonseca mentioned, I called her to talk about a specific area, heat.
Policies, especially the ones that pertain to heat, well, all of them, but again, especially the ones that pertain to heat, they have got to be followed because all of these student athletes who are working out outside could be susceptible to heat illness.
As we learned in the previous episode, exposure to extreme heat can cause different heat illnesses, such as heat rash, sunburn, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and in the worst cases, heat stroke. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, heat stroke has symptoms like high body temperature, hot, red, dry, or damp skin, a fast, strong pulse, headache, dizziness, nausea, confusion, and fainting. It can be life-threatening and requires immediate medical treatment. The longer your body temperature remains high, the greater your risk of complications like organ damage or death. As we have also learned in previous episodes, we know that extreme heat is a characteristic of climate change present in North Carolina. And due to the negative impact that extreme heat can have on the health of students, this also changes how they prepare for each season.
I definitely think that their practices can be very much affected over the course of the week, right? We have these guidelines and these rules in place.
The association's handbook has created a chart that specifies what actions need to be taken according to the wet bulb globe temperature, which not only considers the air temperature and is measured with approved devices.
Schools should have a scientifically approved device to measure wet bulb globe temperature. So it needs to be like a handheld or it's up on a tripod, and it measures the air temperature, it measures the direct sunlight, it measures the humidity, and then ideally it also measures air movement. So the best, the ones that are frankly a little bit more expensive are the ones that are digital, but they also have like a little fan built into them because that air movement plays into that wet bulb globe formula to give you that wet bulb globe reading.
According to the handbook, as the wet bulb globe temperature increases, the athletic activity guidelines require more rest and water breaks, increased monitoring of new athletes, and a reduction in clothing, for example. However, if the wet bulb globe temperature reaches 88 to 89.9 degrees, all athletes must be under constant observation and supervision. They should remove pads and equipment, have mandatory rest and water breaks, and even have a cold or ice immersion pool on site for practice. If the temperature exceeds 90 degrees, all practices must be suspended, and competitions may continue but with mandatory water breaks as designated by the game day administrator. Fonseca added that these regulations also depend on the location of the schools.
I think where people live in the state greatly determines how this is impacting their daily lives. The topography and the climate of the state is different in the East than it is in the West, right? Our schools in the mountains probably have not had to change their practice times or their game times because they don't experience the same heat as they do in the East. So I think it is probably more of a heightened issue. It's something that people are being forced to deal with more on the eastern part of the state than they are in the West.
But the prevention of heat illnesses goes beyond whether or not a practice or a game is canceled. One of the things Fonseca's team wants to work on next year is to enhance their heat policy across all sports, with something they already have outlined in their handbook for high school football.
Is something called exercise acclimatization. The first 5 days of practice, we limit the amount of equipment that the students have on. We limit the intensity, or we manage rather the duration and the intensity of their exercise. The first couple days, they're only wearing helmets. practices are not necessarily shorter, but the bouts of work should be shorter and the periods of rest should be a little bit longer, because that way their bodies are acclimating, they're getting used to being in that hot environment. The next 3 days, they can put shoulder pads on. And again, we're slowly, gradually increasing the duration of their practices. We're increasing the intensity of the exercise as well, while they're also kind of exposed to the elements. And so after those first 5 days, that's when you can put the full, like the pants and the pads, the bottom like half pads will go on. So it's that gradual ramp up, right?
And this process is carried out in this way because of how sweating works.
The body cools itself by sweating and by evaporation. So if you've got something sitting on your head that does not allow for that, moisture to escape, and you don't take it off and take breaks every once in a while, right? That's part of what can lead to heat illness. Same thing with the shoulder pads. There's nowhere for the sweat to go.
This is crucial in sports with heavy equipment, Fonseca explains, but it is also necessary to implement it in any other sport. The reason lies in the fact that when we think about heat and exercising under the sun, we not only consider the minute athletes spend on the fields, but also need to pay attention to the bigger picture.
Those same exercise principles, those exercise acclimatization principles, really should be applied to cross country. They should be applied to soccer. They really can be applied to indoor sport athletes as well, because coming into the fall season as a coach, I may not know what my kids were doing all summer. They could have been sitting inside playing Fortnite in the air conditioning, not getting outside and doing any type of physical activity. And now we're asking them to come in and significantly ramp up their activity.
In addition to considering how much or how little exercise they have done before returning to training, there are other factors that Fonseca considers important.
One other thing I just thought of too is the variation in like the physical bodies of the kids that play football. Wide receivers, defensive backs, safeties tend to be on the tall, thin, not necessarily lanky, but they're just, taller and a little bit thinner. Your linemen are a little bit more like heavy set and stocky, right? So your linemen, because of their body type, are even at higher risk for heat illness simply because that's just the way their bodies are built. And so also thinking about what their conditioning looks like, and their acclimatization might even look a little bit different than those position players because their demands during the games are different. You're going to see a wide receiver potentially run 40, 50 yards on a regular basis. You're never going to see a lineman run that far. It's going to be very rare if a lineman has to run that amount of distance. So they don't need to practice that necessarily. They don't need to condition in the same way. So that's just something else that, again, to be mindful of, especially from a coaching perspective. They can kind of tweak their practices and their conditioning and their exercise acclimatization based on the positions of the student athletes, again, based on the body type that they have.
And usually, at each school, those responsible for assessing all these factors and being among the first to ensure the safety and health of students are the licensed athletic trainers.
Athletic trainers at the high school level on the day-to-day basis are, again, there for practices. They're making sure that, there's water available for student athletes. They're making sure that those student athletes' bodies are ready for practice. And then they're there in the event of an injury that takes place. They're the first ones to respond and to evaluate that injury, determine the level of severity, determine if it's something that needs to go on and see a physician, if it's something that can be managed by the athletic trainer through therapeutic exercises or rehabilitation at school, or if it's something that is emergent, right, and needs to be referred on to the emergency room. So athletic trainers have that not necessarily algorithmic thinking, but more critical thinking, right? They're presented with a scenario. They know what questions to start asking. And then it's like, choose your own adventure. Based on the answers, what is the next step that needs to happen?
And to prevent any heat illness, their role is key.
When it comes to heat, especially, athletic trainers are critical because usually they're the ones that are responsible for measuring the wet bulb globe temperature, right? So when it comes to heat, it's critically important that an athletic trainer has the right device to measure this wet bulb globe temperature, that they're out there on the practice field, 30 minutes prior to the start of when practice is, to get that most accurate reading.
And with that reading, determine whether it is safe for practice to continue or if it needs to be modified or canceled.
So if that reading is, on the upper end and practices are allowed to continue, the athletic trainer is then responsible for keeping their eyes on every single kid that's out there at practice, making sure that water breaks are taken at appropriate times, making sure that kids are actually drinking water during, those water breaks. There are also other things, that other kind of cooling methods. Athletic trainers play such an important role when it comes to heat. Sometimes that can be a difficult role because they are often then viewed as the bearer of bad news, right? If that wet bulb globe temperature gets to the point where they have to suspend practice or they have to move inside, again, it's the athletic trainer relaying that message to the coach, but then the coach also understanding that that's their job, right? And that's the lane that they're in. And it's from a safety standpoint. They're not doing it just to disrupt practice. They're not just doing it to, be a pain in the butt and not be ready for the game on Friday night, but they are doing it because we have research and clinical information that says they should not be participating in full gear outside when the wet bulb globe hits that certain reading.
At the same time, although they might be perceived as the bearer of bad news, they often do more than just keeping a student safe.
I've heard many stories of athletic trainers not having any issues with the student athletes on the field, but having to be called up into the stands to deal with health issues of spectators. So that is definitely something that I think is happening more and more often, because those are, the families, the grandparents. They definitely haven't been outside in this heat, and even though they're not exerting themselves, they may have some other pre-existing condition that is, lending them to be dehydrated, or they're showing up to a game dehydrated. They're not taking in enough water. They're sitting in the heat. They go to stand up quickly. Maybe they pass out and then they hit their head.
But of course, the presence of an athletic trainer at each school can also depend on the resources that that school has.
Because one thing that I have definitely learned in my time here is that the resources vary tremendously, right? Based on school to school. There are schools that don't have access to athletic trainers. In North Carolina, we have a state board of education rule that really, trying to think the best word I want to use to describe it, strongly encourages an athletic trainer, because that is the gold standard, right? That is a licensed healthcare provider with training in all of those areas, education in all of those areas that I mentioned. I think right now in our member schools, I think we're right around 65% of our schools that have access to a licensed athletic trainer, which is actually about 20% higher than the national average, which is excellent. But in my opinion, it still isn't good enough. I think every high school should have access to a licensed athletic trainer.
And just as with the access to hiring athletic trainers, some schools face difficulties in having sophisticated equipment to measure the wet bulb globe temperature, or even to have AEDs.
An AED is an automated external defibrillator. So in the cases of sudden cardiac arrest, outcomes are significantly better. Number one, if somebody recognizes what's going on and is able to start CPR, but then also implement what we call an emergency action plan. So that is calling 911, sending somebody to retrieve the appropriate emergency equipment, which a lot of times needs to include an automatic external defibrillator, an AED, and then being able to have somebody that was trained in using that AED and applying it. And our goal is to have, for all of our schools, to have access to an AED so that from anywhere on their campus where any activity is happening, that they can get to an AED and have it on a collapsed individual with suspected cardiac arrest within 3 minutes. Because data tells us that outcomes can significantly improve if you get that AED on somebody within 3 minutes while somebody is doing quality CPR. So those two things are really, really critical.
But there are schools in North Carolina that cannot afford these expenses.
One of the things that I love doing is going out and doing site visits for our schools and going through our health and safety policies and just the variety of just the variation in resources that you see in terms of access to schools have these amazing weight room facilities where they can do all of this extra weight training and conditioning, and then you've got other schools that don't have anything like that and maybe have one AED for the entire school, where that school with the great weight room has 5 or 6 AEDs because their campus is so large.
And that's why much of Fonseca's work involves adapting the regulations to each circumstance.
So being able to kind of walk our schools through the policies, what they like, how they read in the handbook, right? And then how they need to be practically implemented and be able to meet those schools where they're at in terms of their resources and needs is a big part of what I do. But it's meaningful. I think it's so important, right? Because again, at the end of the day, our policies mean nothing if they're simply written in this handbook and they aren't actually carried out and implemented in our schools. So being able to kind of see it for myself and really understand, okay, we can say that this is what needs to be done, but then once we actually see it and see some of the barriers to implementing it, that's where we can kind of come in and creatively say, okay, yes, this is the rule, you need to follow it. Let's think about how, what challenges you have in your community or at your particular location or at your particular school. And how do we get you where you need to be in terms of policy compliance?
And in cases where there isn't enough budget for a licensed athletic trainer, for example, some solutions can be found.
So that State Board of Ed policy strongly encourages, again, an athletic trainer. In the absence of an athletic trainer, a school can have somebody that is considered a first responder. I actually prefer to use the term athletic first responder to distinguish it, because it is not just the typical, I think the term first responder, people think of, policemen and firemen and EMTs and paramedics. These are individuals per the NCHSAA guideline that also have to be CPR AED certified. They have to be first aid certified. They have to take a course in concussion recognition. And then they have to have 10 hours of continuing education in injury recognition and management as well.
I asked Fonseca if she noticed any changes in the attention given to extreme heat now, or if any new positions have been created in the industry.
When I was in college, I'm trying to think, we were measuring it back then. We were using very not digital devices. We used something called a sling psychrometer that basically measured the air temperature and then basically the heat that was radiating off of the field. So that sling psychrometer had a cloth at the end of it that we had to get wet, and we had to spin it around in the air, I think for 30 seconds, and that would measure the humidity. And then we would lay it down on the ground and it would measure the surface temperature of the turf, and that was the reading that we used. But even we were measuring it, but even then, that was 20 years ago. I don't remember changing our practices because it was too hot. I think we just needed to know what the temperature was. I don't ever remember modifying our practices. So I think it's been in the last, probably more of a focus in the last 10 to 15 years, especially at the high school level.
Fonseca has a theory about why more attention has begun to be paid to these issues, even starting from the NFL.
There was a lot of change that happened after, I think it was in 2001, when a player named Corey Stringer died of exertional heat stroke.
Minnesota Vikings Pro Bowl tackle Corey Stringer is dead a day after he collapsed at training camp, 2 days after he was taken off the practice field on a car.
And so that was where, again, the spotlight started on the NFL, and eventually those policies trickled down to the college and now, the high school levels. And unfortunately, it's usually after somebody dies as a result of that incident, right? Where people now say, oh, well, there was no policy, or the policy was too lax, or the policy wasn't being followed. And so something that, again, why I'm so passionate about educating people about our policies is that, again, they're very sound. They're evidence-based, and that tells us that if we follow them, the chances of these bad outcomes are less. So that's why it's important to know what they are up front and to have the tools and the resources you need to implement them at your school.
Fonseca is another resident of North Carolina who is passionate about her work. Like many we've heard from in this series, In fact, during our conversation, Fonseca shared something that I found very interesting, something that connects to previous episodes.
I think there could be space for athletic trainers in settings other than athletics to help manage heat-related illnesses for laborers who are outdoors. I see every time, like this week again, like driving by all the construction that's happening, everybody that's outside, they're in equipment also, right? What do their employers, what guidelines are they following? Who is there to treat their heat illness? Because they're out in it even more. Usually they're also in that very heavy equipment. They're usually in even a thicker, like jeans and pants and long sleeve shirts, just from a protective standpoint for the nature of the work that they're doing. I see sometimes the coolers of water on their work trucks, but are they full? Is it just water? Is it cold? Do they have, Gatorade? Do they have electrolytes? Do they have somebody, again, watching the wet bulb? Do they have somebody kind of measuring their exertion level? I don't know. So I think that's definitely an area where there could be opportunity for somebody, again, to be monitoring and planning and putting policies and helping to implement policies, and then obviously responding and intervening if needed, if somebody does, have a heat illness in that type of setting.
And that's how Jana Fonseca's dedication to health and safety in schools not only impacts the students and athletes, but also prompts us to think about how these same principles could be applied to other sectors, like labor, where extreme heat and tough conditions are a daily reality. Fonseca leaves us with a powerful thought. Prevention and care are essential in every field, from football fields to construction sites. And this concludes the final episode of our series. Thank you so much for listening and following along with these stories on how climate change is reshaping North Carolina. I am Natalia Sanchez Loayza, and we will see you next time.